Welcome to the Future of Sharing, the series where we're looking hard at how do we make the sharing economy work for everyone. I'm Pete Leiden, I'm the founder of Reinvent, and today we are in Philadelphia for the Democratic National Convention on a sweltering July day here with various convention goers around us that you might hear from time to time off camera here. And we're here with Laura Murphy, and Laura is the former head of the American Civil Liberties Union Washington Legislative Office, and she left that in 2015, and she is now up at Harvard in essentially serving with an advanced leadership fellowship, which is looking at civil liberties in the sharing economy. So we're very happy to have you here.
Thank you.
So we're here at the DNC talking politics. So give us a little bit of your background and exposure to Washington and politics before we get to the sharing economy.
So there were 14 runs for public office in my immediate family, and I grew up in Baltimore, Maryland. Wow. And because I worked on the campaign of the first black congressman from Baltimore, Perrin Mitchell, I was offered a full-time job working in his congressional office, and then I worked for Shirley Chisholm, and then I became a lobbyist for the ACLU. And then after that, I moved around the country. I lived in LA and I lived in Chicago, and eventually made my way back to Washington, DC. So half of my 40-year career has been working for elected officials, and the other half has been in civil liberties and civil rights advocacy with the ACLU. And so I've worked for elected officials at the state, federal, and municipal levels, and I ran the lobbying operation for 17 years for the ACLU in Washington, D.C., which sent me to the White House with meetings with the president and to the Justice Department and meeting with senior members of Congress.
Awesome. So then, just given your kind of expertise in politics, when did you start kind of tuning in or hearing about or starting to get aware of the sharing economy and your own kind of exposure to it and thinking about it?
Probably in the last decade. I, as head of the ACLU Washington office, we became increasingly concerned about consumer privacy. And so as the digital economy grew and the collection of data grew exponentially, and we were mainly concerned about the government tracking citizens for their political beliefs or their religious beliefs, which certainly got elevated after the events of 9/11, where we saw, we heard about programs where the government was monitoring the international phone calls, the emails, of individuals who they deemed to be terrorists, or in many cases for routine criminal investigations. They use terrorism laws like the Patriot Act to find a way to monitor citizens and go around the requirements of the Fourth Amendment, which, for people who don't know, require the government get a warrant before it searches your person or your property or your possessions. And so the ACLU began pushing for Fourth Amendment protections in the digital space so that your emails would be protected, your cell phone communications would be protected. And even today, the laws don't adequately protect citizens' rights in the digital era. They've not been sufficiently updated. And so when we embarked upon those concerns, we found that the digital world also opened up a Pandora's box of civil liberties and civil rights concerns, whether it was net neutrality or making sure that people had access to computers even. And, because now there are many jobs that are listed online. They never reach a newspaper. And so if you don't have access to a computer, if computers aren't in your public libraries and you can't afford to own one, you're kind of locked out of the marketplace. So equality and issues of justice, they've been on my mind for over a decade. And I had the privilege of supervising a staff of 35 people, 18 of whom were lobbyists. And so we had lobbyists who were devoted to this, and it meant going to the White House and speaking with the privacy czar. We worked on the Civil Liberties and Civil Rights Oversight Board. So, you know, I've been pleased to be on the ground floor of some of these issues, but they're far from being resolved.
I hear you. Now, given that you mentioned the orientation towards government and privacy, has that evolved as well into the privacy with, you know, private companies and kind of access to that?
Yeah, even though it started out with the government and government surveillance, really the government relies on the private sector for all of its surveillance programs. And also the private sector knows much more about us than the government ever will. You know, online tracking is a big deal. So with some of these data mining programs that the private sector uses, you know, they can almost anticipate, and they do anticipate, some of the purchases you're going to make, some of the websites you might be interested in looking at. And I remember just clicking on one clothing website just out of curiosity, and all of a sudden on my Facebook page, on my email page, these advertisements would pop up. And so this sphere of data collection about our every activity, millennials especially seem to have gotten used to it. They put their pictures up, they put their personal information up in a way we would have never conceived of, you know, 20, 30, 40 years ago. And so really working with digital companies to get them to understand the principles that are in our civil rights laws and in the Bill of Rights. It's a tough thing because they're driven by economic opportunity, and there's a gold mine when a company can find out all of your personal interests, who you talk to, what websites you visit, who your friends are on Facebook or LinkedIn. It's just amazing. So this is a new frontier for rights and liberties.
Completely. So then there's the general digital space, which is very broad and there are many different aspects in which you've raised here with privacy. And then there's this kind of, I guess you could say, a subset of digital companies about the sharing economy, like Airbnb, Uber, that are about sharing on these platforms, essentially, or trading commerce. How about that? Were you kind of in the last few years kind of shifting to that? And like, for example, you mentioned this thing at Harvard. You're actually focusing on that subset of the whole digital economy?
Yeah, I think that the sharing economy represents the new frontier of capitalism. The number of goods and services that are promoted, exchanged, purchased online is just incredible, and the growth has been exponential. And so, whereas during the civil rights era, you know, there were sit-ins at lunch counters because, you know, a restaurant refused to serve black customers. In the sharing economy, it's, well, what if the Uber driver doesn't want to pick up a black customer? What if an Airbnb host doesn't want to rent to a Muslim American or a gay couple? So the laws that we've had to keep things, to try to keep things, they never were equal, but to try to strive toward equality, really don't exactly and neatly apply to the sharing economy. And some civil rights organizations are trying to get the laws changed. Some state and local governments are trying to regulate. And the question is, does it make sense? And what are the best ways to bring in those values of fair treatment and equality? And will we need to go to legislative bodies at the state and federal level to get that done? Or can the consumer persuade the companies to recognize it's in their enlightened self-interest to make sure that their goods and services reach the broadest possible consumer base and don't discriminate based on zip code or skin color or religion or that sort of thing?
Awesome. So you've taken. How would you describe your fellowship then? That you're taking it, you're pulling back and taking some time to really think about this, to talk to people, or to describe a little bit more what you're doing in this project.
Well, it's still very raw. Okay.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
And I've been sidetracked this summer where I was supposed to really dive into it by this consulting position I have with Airbnb, leading up their 90-day review process on the discrimination issue that they've had on their platform.
Okay, well, why don't you talk about that then? Let's talk about that as long as you brought that up.
Okay,
and we'll get to the broader thing in a little bit later.
Okay, so I was contacted by Airbnb to ask if I would consider helping them on the discrimination issue, which has been bubbling for a couple of years on Airbnb's platforms. Allegations that hosts have turned down customers because of the color of their skin, or because they're gay, or because they're transgendered, or because they're Muslim. And the company grew so fast. It was started in 2008 by a group of young guys in their 20s, and who had no grounding or no reason to be grounded into building a company that had an infrastructure to deal with the discrimination issue. So I came in and I got an understanding of the problem. I saw studies that had been done on Airbnb, and I talked to the company officials and gathered as much data as possible. And what I said to them is that they really needed to have an infrastructure to deal with the discrimination issues. And so the first 90 days is really building the foundation so that they can make sure that their platform is operating in a fair and equitable manner. And what does that mean?
Yeah, what does that mean?
That means having a robust anti-discrimination policy that's not difficult to find on the website. And for hosts and guests, they will, in the near future, have to sign that they've read the anti-discrimination policy and they agree to abide by it as a condition of operating on Airbnb's platform. That's just a basic thing. Then there has to be training available to hosts, because a lot of people have implicit bias that they're not even aware of. And so we want to offer the host training about how to kind of bring to the fore what your prejudices are and maybe how to overcome them and understand why they exist. Then training for the customer service personnel who receive complaints, because people will complain about a lost key or something like that. But really these discrimination complaints need to go to a specialized area within the company that is trained to deal with discrimination. Then we have to look at the workforce issue, because perhaps if Airbnb had a more diverse workforce, they would have caught these issues sooner. And so I'm looking at programs to improve the diversity of the workforce so that there's someone on the inside telling them about some of these issues, and they don't have to wait for a trove of negative publicity before they take action. So we're looking at the platform, the policies. We're also building partnerships so that Airbnb is more present in the civil rights community. They get to know the players. Maybe they fund some of the activities of that community so that they are a good corporate citizen. So those three components, the platform, the policies, and the partnerships, are the things I'm focusing on in the first 90 days. And sometime around Labor Day, we will be announcing some structural changes in the organization to ensure that these issues don't happen and they don't fester if they do happen.
Fascinating. So when you use the word infrastructure, you mean all the pieces you just said there as the fundamental infrastructure, or do you mean literally the platform technical infrastructure?
I meant all of the pieces. I use infrastructure kind of not the same way people in the tech community use
Yeah.
infrastructure, but I'm including that platform
Okay.
part, but I'm also looking at the corporate structure
I see.
to make sure that there are people who are charged with responsibility to address these issues.
I see.
So I consider that kind of the more layman's terms in terms of infrastructure. You know, where is the locus of responsibility? Where does it sit in the corporation? Who has the authority to act? That sort of thing. So it's a very comprehensive review that I'm leading up.
Are you in a position to talk a little bit more about the platform itself, though? Is there senses that these sharing economy platforms could be designed in a technical sense differently so that
Absolutely.
you could do this? That's interesting.
Absolutely.
What can you tell us about that?
So, for example, a lot of people have complained that Airbnb uses pictures. And pictures allow hosts to see who's a minority and who isn't in most cases, and to discriminate and decide not to reply, decide that all of a sudden the room that the guest is seeking is taken, you know. So a lot of the civil rights groups feel that pictures make it easier to discriminate, and they want Airbnb to be more like Craigslist or something, you know, or eBay, something where you have anonymity. But they don't understand that the whole mission of Airbnb is belonging anywhere.
Yeah.
And it's hard to belong if you're not using a picture
Yeah.
and you're using a pseudonym, and also when you're living in people's intimate spaces.
Yeah.
So we've been working with the engineers to figure out, okay, we want to use pictures, but can we make them later in the process? Can we show a person's picture after the booking? Can we elevate a person's ratings? Because what we found is that when a guest has great ratings, that trumps everything. That even trumps race or sexual orientation. Hosts want good guests. And they want good paying guests who don't mess up their properties, you know. And so putting some of that information ahead of the picture, we think will reduce the ability of a host to engage in, you know, overt discrimination. Then another thing that we're looking at is maybe rewarding hosts who take anti-bias training by, you know, creating badges for them, and then making it easier to search hosts who have taken the training, because hosts really like being, you know, high on the list of search results.
Yep.
So if you're looking for a room in Philadelphia, a certain group of hosts will pop up, depending on whether you want to be in a 2-bedroom house or a 1-bedroom condo or whatever. And so can we look at elevating hosts and telling hosts they will be elevated if they go through a series of trainings that make them a more kind of cosmopolitan, accepting, worldly, bias-free host. And can they get badges for that? So yes, there are technical ways to reduce discrimination, and we're looking at those things. We're not just looking at policies, we're not just looking at people, you know, the employees, we're looking at platform design issues.
That's fascinating. And so you kind of enumerated all those. It wouldn't be something you'd think about as like, oh, because there is something fundamental to the sharing economy in general, is the person-to-person connection. By definition, it's, you know, connecting peers or customers to hosts. I mean, and so there is something so visceral about a face or about a, you know, who is that person, you want to know. But I can see where it would complicate it if someone did have racial bias or some kind of bias. It's a complicated problem.
Right, and you don't want a situation where, let's say, an Asian person shows up and this person is hostile to Asians, this host, and they're shocked and they have no ability to kind of overcome their own stereotypes and biases. You don't want to put people in a situation where that initial encounter is uncomfortable. So I think a picture is useful in getting people mentally prepared to encounter each other. At the same time, you know, there are going to be people with biases no matter what you do, and Airbnb should be in a position to encourage people to get over those biases. You know, now it's fine to have a bias if someone is a bad person, but is it okay to have a bias just because of someone's sexual orientation, because of someone's race? I mean, should we as a society allow people who use these sharing economy platforms to say, oh, we're open to the public, but we're not open to that part of the public? That's going to happen, but how do we stack the system so that people can really learn about other cultures and they can be more tolerant and accepting when they open their home to strangers?
Very interesting. So, I mean, it does bring up this larger question. I'm assuming even from your larger project, you're kind of thinking about it, is like, who's responsible at some level, or how, like, there is this, let's just say, societal racism or something in some sectors of the population or something. We're seeing it in our politics,
think?
frankly. Exactly. So, and then there's this company who's really trying to do the right thing, or you know, and I'm not just saying Airbnb, but let's say a company in this space trying to do that. And it is a kind of an interesting thing, and you're in an interesting position to kind of talk about this, is like, how responsible is who, or, you know, how can you, I mean, it's interesting, is like, how much should the company be expected to do to deal with something that is a huge and very complex problem for society? I'm just curious how you think about that.
Right. Well, I'm fortunate in that Airbnb wants to do something about this problem.
Yeah.
This is my area of expertise,
Yeah.
civil rights and civil liberties. And I don't think it would work if I was working with a company that really didn't want to do the right thing.
Right.
But the founders of the company are very concerned how discrimination undermines their entire mission. And their entire mission is built around the theory of belonging, and that all of us belong everywhere. And that the world's a small place, we need to accommodate each other, we need to get to know each other, we need to make room for each other. And so I think it's really fantastic that this company wants to do this, because it's such a dominant force in the public accommodation sphere. So as an advocate, I'm going to likely impact many more people through the affirmative work that Airbnb does than if I worked on a city council resolution in Philadelphia that bars discrimination. You know, because the universe of people in Philadelphia is smaller than the universe of people who will be affected by the policies we come up with Airbnb. And this kind of gets back to the data and data privacy issue. When companies now hold more data on people than the government does, why would you limit your activities on ending racial discrimination, protecting privacy, and all of that totally to the government sphere, when your bigger market is the private sector? And again, if this was not in the company's enlightened self-interest, I don't think they would be doing it. It may be the right thing to do, but if it didn't make financial sense, I don't know that they would be doing it either, because now more than half the babies who are born in the United States are children of color. The biggest world markets that are growing their middle classes are China, India, South America, Africa, and these are people of color. So while this program that I'm working on only covers the United States activities of Airbnb, the US activities, it's really a great trial run for helping people travel throughout the world. And if they want to be part of the future marketplace, it makes sense for them to deal with discrimination issues now than try to deal with it when they're trying to penetrate South America in a really heavy way 5 years from now.
Well, the logic you just laid out, very compelling anyhow, set aside our Airbnb, but it would be compelling to almost any sharing economy company, or for that matter, any company that has any kind of global aspirations. So let's maybe take it to a broader context, because again, back maybe to your initial fellowship idea of like the whole sharing economy. Do you think the way forward in this issue, whether it's Uber or whoever, Etsy or whoever is doing it, there's a similar kind of way forward through working with the companies, kind of framing this as in everyone's best interests, coming up with designs to the platforms that kind of deal with this? I mean, I'm just curious how you think broader about the broader economy about this stuff.
Well, more broadly, I think it is important for companies to be prepared for complaints of discrimination. They will emerge. It's the United States, at least in the era of Trump and Clinton. There is a lot of racial animosity. There are concerns about police violence in black communities. There are demonstrations in the streets. To have a company stick its head in the sand and say there's not a problem out there, I think is naive, and I think it's also dangerous. Because as we've seen in the Airbnb's case, you know, this whole issue around discrimination has erupted and has become a very serious distraction that Airbnb's competitors are exploiting. So you want to think about these things if you're in the sharing economy. Secondly, you know, you just don't know where discrimination is going to manifest itself because it's so much a part of our culture in the United States. So given that, you just can't do one thing and expect it to solve discrimination for all time. You can't say, oh, we support Martin Luther King holiday and we're funding a parade, and that's the corporate demonstration of how we're dealing with race discrimination in the country. No, I don't think so. You need to look at your platform, you need to look at your policies, and you need to look at your partnerships. And nothing short of a sustained effort in this space, an awareness, a continued participation in the conversation, is going to protect a company from a potential crisis.
So it's interesting. So the thrust of this project we've been working on, the future of sharing, has been thinking about the target is a little bit more like getting city governments or getting people in politics to understand the adaptation of our old regulatory world into a kind of new era of kind of rules and regulations and laws. But what's interesting about what you're saying about it is you really aren't talking about it in terms, at least so far, in terms of what the elected officials or something could do to set the context. You're really thinking about it more from the kind of companies themselves.
Well, listen, the elected officials are going to go there.
Okay, well, let's talk about that, because that's kind of a lot
I mean,
of what we're talking about.
you know, you look at cities where a lot of the sharing economy is focused. I mean, they're not really, for example, Uber, is it likely to focus on transportation in rural areas? No, it's really going to focus mainly, in their market share that they're interested in are in cities. And in most American cities, you have strong minority populations. You have a disproportionate number of minority elected officials on city councils and state legislatures. So you may be going to those officials about, you know, regulatory schemes and taxes. They may be coming to you and saying, okay, what are you doing about the problems my constituents are having with your corporation? Like not enough Uber drivers servicing this region of town, what are the other companies in the sharing economy? I can give you any example you like of how their distribution of product could break down along economic, racial, religious lines inadvertently. And so I think if you look at the political players that you need to protect your company's market share, to make sure that it's regulated fairly and not too heavy-handedly, then you're going to need to look at these various caucuses. Like, why wouldn't you talk about the interest of Latino people with the sharing economy in Los Angeles?
Right.
You know?
Yeah, just from a business.
Or the Asian American community in San Francisco or Seattle.
Yeah, totally get it. Now, and again, a compelling conversation or argument actually for the companies themselves. But let's say, what advice would you be giving to elected officials or mayors or whatever in various cities that are starting to wrap their heads on this? Are there lessons you're learning from your experience here, or from that actually you could give advice to them about how some of the things you're kind of pioneering here or learning about here could be applied more in a,
Absolutely.
hey, this is a regular, here's what we're going to do. Is every sharing economy company has to XXX, or maybe these kind have to do this and these kind have to do that. I mean, is there any kind of emerging body of regulations that might be starting to happen here?
It is emerging. I think a lot of legislators are concerned about taxing the sharing economy.
That's the driver.
They want revenue. They want a piece of the action for the services that their city or jurisdiction is providing in the sharing economy, whether it's making sure that the cable system works well, or the cell towers are located well. The government's attitude is, look, you wouldn't exist if government didn't have kind of infrastructure here. You ought to pay just like the stores pay. So they're going to come at it from taxing, for sure. But then they're going to have pressures on them from competing industries that are not part of the sharing economy. So in the case of Uber, it might be the taxi cab companies. And in the case of Airbnb, it might be the hotel industry. And so they're going to be caught between kind of the old guard in terms of the business community and the new guard. So I think the essential message for the sharing economy is, if they don't tell their story and why it's good for the citizens of a certain jurisdiction, other people will tell their story for them. And in telling that story, they need to be concerned about the entire community, not just the elite market share that everybody wants, but how the working man and woman, how the low-income person, how the religious minority, how everybody will benefit from their particular sharing economy industry. So I am seeing lessons. And the lesson is, don't get caught short. You need to get a team in place that speaks to the needs of the elected officials who are inclined to regulate your industry.
Okay, and so I like that a lot. So you've kind of crystallized advice, you could say, to the companies themselves. What advice, though, would you give to cities? Because like you say, it's still early days, it's not really clear exactly what to do, but is there anything they could do to stimulate or accelerate this process with companies? Or is there any way that they could create an early framework, or would you advise them to kind of wait and see or experiment? I'm just curious if your thoughts on if you were just starting to really figure this out in your city, what would you start thinking about?
Well, I think a city needs to assess who the industry is good for. And a lot of people are using an old paradigm to assess new industries. So they look at something like Uber or Airbnb and say, Well, those people who are driving their cars really need to be in the taxi business. And those people who are renting out their homes really need to be in the hotel business, because that's where good, solid jobs are. Well, the job market is changing, and those jobs with great benefits that are protected by the unions are disappearing. So people are looking at a variety of ways to supplement their primary income. Mm-hmm. Working mothers, working parents are looking for flexible schedules. Mm-hmm. So in assessing these industries, don't be so rigid to look at this old paradigm of what used to work back in the day, without understanding how these new opportunities can actually be more attractive for retirees, for working parents, for people who need flexible schedules, for people who need to work part-time. I mean, I've met so many college students in the Boston area who are paying off student loans by moonlighting, you know, doing Uber. So I think wishing the old days were back is not the way to go.
So as we kind of wrap up here, you're talking about issues that are, again, really emotional issues right now around race, around discrimination, but yet you see a lot of hopeful signs you've laid out here. How optimistic are you that these kind of platforms in the sharing economy will work out well as opposed to badly in the long run?
I think they'll work out well. I think consumers will drive some of it, lawmakers will drive some of it, and the companies will have a big role in how their industries work out. Either they'll be smart and they'll anticipate some of these issues and be attentive to them, and they will describe themselves instead of having other people describe them, or they will be victims of currents that are out of their control. So I'm optimistic that the smart industries will tackle some of these tough issues aggressively, and they won't be victim to the changing fortunes of whatever's going on outside of their control.
That's a good place to stop. A very optimistic note on a very difficult kind of issue, but thank you so much for actually laying out your thoughts on this, and good luck with it.
Thank you. I'll need it.